With the forthcoming release of Zack Snyder's Justice League coming out on HBO Max this week, I thought it might be a good time to go back to the roots of the DCEU and take a more analytical approach to the movie that got us here, Man of Steel. Envisioned as a kind of reactionary hybrid to both The Dark Knight and Superman Returns, the earliest conceptualizations of Man of Steel took place in conversations between blockbuster auteur Christopher Nolan and the man who wrote both Batman Begins and Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance, David S. Goyer, in 2008. Christopher Nolan was reportedly impressed with Goyer's treatment for presenting Superman in a more grounded context on screen, something Warner Brothers were eager to pursue in both tone and advertising at the time given the recent success of The Dark Knight. By contrast, Superman Returns was a movie criticized for being too much of a retread and send-up of the Donner-Lester duology, and for being a 3-hour-long Superman movie where Superman doesn't punch anybody. It doesn't help that it was directed by Bryan Singer. The important takeaway from all of this is that Man of Steel was crafted in order to directly address the criticisms of Superman Returns using the tonal palette of The Dark Knight. I think it's important to acknowledge upfront that I don't hate Man of Steel, nor do I think it's as insulting to its audience as something like The Rise of Skywalker is, and in fact there are things that I do like about it, and I'll talk about them, the first of which is Krypton. The opening on Krypton is pretty cool actually. For starters, I like that Jor-El and Zod are ostensibly on the same side of the Kryptonian conflict in the way that the Council refuses to believe that the planet Krypton is doomed, and Zod and Jor-El both know the truth and they're actively seeking to remedy the situation as best they can. Usually the best relationships between villains and heroes posture the two as opposing hemispheres across an ideological horizon, and the makings of that are here between Jor-El and Zod. Unfortunately, they're also muddled by the script and only kind of saved by the performance, which is something we'll see throughout. Let me use the scene where Zod begins his coup attempt against the Council to show you what I mean. We start with Jor-El appealing to the Council not to save Krypton or the people there, but to save its culture and its future in the wake of annihilation using the Kryptonian Codex, which they don't grant him. Then, in Zod's first scene, he walks up like a badass, caps a capitalist, and scorns the bourgeoisie council for their legislative failures.
Lawmakers with their endless debates.
This is solid. It gives Zod motivation while establishing him as a credible threat, and it's all bolstered by a very committed performance. After making his demands, Zod is admonished by Jor-El, and Zod asks him to join forces and to sever the degenerative bloodlines that led us to this state. And this is what presents a problem. My big issue is that Zod's bloodline comment goes against what we just established about him. Aside from making no sense, as Zod is a proponent of Krypton's forced population control, and therefore must continue to support the system by which these politicians are bred rather than born, it's also completely superfluous and comes across as cheap. Jor-El and Zod should already be on opposing hemispheres of the ideological horizon, and so this information becomes pointless and redundant to the audience. Jor-El is a man of sound and just ideology, but who lacks action. He takes the Council's decision without much in the way of pushback and has resigned his fate with that of Krypton's before the movie even starts. He's a victim of the Council's endless debate in the face of issues which require actionable response, and his suggestion of action is not enough to save the planet. Zod, inversely, is a man of action whose ideology is deeply flawed. This is made evident even when he does shit like cap a council member before declaring that the rest are going to stand trial, which is kind of darkly funny. The differences between these two should set up a pretty good character arc for Superman, one in which he proves to both men and to himself that action and ideology are useless without one informing the other. This should also set up a stronger narrative position for Pa Kent to inhabit, maybe as the arbiter of the will to do the right thing, to do what no man could do before. But this is all what the Bloodlines angle of Zod spoils. It cheapens the complexity of his character. The Bloodline information is meant to seem like it's going to be important to the viewer, but it's not. We don't see any new Kryptonians being born, nor is there any kind of real impact or conflict generated by this aspect of Kryptonian society. So does it really have a place here? My reading of it is just that it's kind of there to make Zod more overtly evil, which is lame, and it robs the story of palpable drama in the way of any actual ideological stakes. The audience is forced to discount Zod's perspective on account of the fact that he's a blood purist, and that only serves to make him more boring. What makes this point even more sore for me is that the better version of their characterizations permeate the movie, like when Zod gives credit to Jor-El a couple different times, once in spite of the Council, and again in an appeal to Kal, both times recognizing Jor-El's foresight relative to the fall of Krypton.
Jor-El was right. You're a pack of fools.
And it all comes across as genuine, and it colors in the differences between Zod and Jor-El as figureheads for the future of the Kryptonian people in spite of the Bloodlines nonsense. Shifting more toward the performance itself, Zod really does come across as a man with a vision for his race's future in this movie. Maybe he's a zealot, but he's a compelling candidate to ensure the future of the Kryptonian race. And Michael Shannon's performance does nothing if not underscore that fundamental conviction. Sure, Zod is reduced to a single motivation as a consequence of the dumb plot, but the performance really does key in the reality of his plight to the viewer, and that makes his singular motivation a compelling one, especially when his concern for the species' survival is proven correct at the beginning of the movie. Zod doesn't really show up again until the third act, and we'll get there, but I do think that the core motivations and his strengths ring true for the majority of the time he's on screen. Moving on to people not named Zod, something I always found weird about the movie is how little dialogue Superman actually has. Like, he's a pretty quiet guy here.
Where the hell did they find you, Greenhorn?
Let's get this crap in the air!
Maybe it's because the first half focuses on Clark's youth, where he's played by two younger actors, while the character only has 96 lines of dialogue in the whole movie. Or maybe it's because Clark spends the first half of the movie deliberately avoiding people, but he suffers for it either way. A lot can be done with a quieter protagonist, but that comes with the trade-off of making the character's dialogue really matter, and that's a big part of the reason the movie doesn't work for me. Henry Cavill's a good actor. He's given absolutely nothing to do for the first half of the movie, and barely anything that passes for a character once he puts on the suit. We watch Clark as an adult save an oil rig, steal some clothes, quit his job, destroy a truck, play bag boy to Lois, get poked by a robot, and stalk his dad, all before he has anything important to say. Legitimately, Clark is barely a character in this movie, and most of what is there is established in little vignette flashbacks, like Clark learning the truth about how the Kents found him, or saving a bus full of kids from drowning. Even in these flashbacks, Clark barely says a word to anybody that's not his dad. We get the weird, ginger, recurring Smallville guy who knows about Clark and his abilities from childhood after Clark saves him. We see him go on to become like a friend down the line, and finally we see him as an adult working at an IHOP during the Smallville fight. Clark says exactly 0 things to this friend over the course of this 2-hour and 20-minute movie, and yet we as the audience are meant to look at these two characters we basically don't know, watch them make eye contact for a second, and go, ah, it's his friend from earlier. While we're still hanging out around the subject of Clark Kent and his characterization, I want to talk about one of the best and most disappointing scenes in the movie. The scene where Clark Kent meets his mom after learning the truth of his Kryptonian heritage. It's the first time in the movie that Henry Cavill's Superman really feels like Clark Kent. I think the scene works because Martha Kent is the only character we get to see interact with Clark throughout his entire journey. There's a flashback earlier in the movie that establishes the trust that Clark has in Martha as he's discovering his abilities for the first time, and that connection carries over here. Clark arrives home to tell his mom that he's discovered, through sheer happenstance and luck I should note,
But the Americans are there too. Lots of them.
Anything
They're
else?
calling it an anomalous object.
the origin of his people. Martha tries to take it in stride, and Sally Field is adept at conveying the effort required of Martha to understand her son's impossible situation. There's a sense of tenderness and mutual understanding given to the idea of a mother fearing that she may lose her son, and that serves as a nice tonal accent to the conversation between them, and it's one of the very few genuine character moments in the film.
I'm worried they'll take you away from me.
Unfortunately, the emotional resonance is impacted by Clark's lack of characterization up until this point, as well as something I consider to be a pretty big wasted opportunity and a disappointment, which is the fact that the Kents are not canonically Jewish. Let me explain. For those not in the know, Superman was developed by 2 Jewish dudes, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Much like Bill Finger and Bob Kane, who created Batman, Siegel and Shuster were first-generation Jewish immigrants, the Siegels having fled rising anti-Semitism in Europe and Lithuania ahead of the First World War shortly before Jerry was born. The debut of Superman preceded the Second World War by about a year, and he and his adventures would go on to serve as a beacon of hope for American audiences throughout the duration of World War II and onward, although without his Jewish heritage intact. The timing of Superman's debut and the masking of his more apparent Jewish aspects are, in my opinion, not so coincidental. It warrants remembering that the United States' involvement in World War II stems primarily from retribution for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, rather than the atrocities being committed by Germany and the Axis powers in Europe. The reality is that anti-Semitism was on the rise in the United States at the time as well. The tail end of the 19th century saw the rise of prolific anti-black and anti-Semitic groups, such as the KKK, begin to organize in earnest as a reaction to Reconstruction and throughout the Industrial Revolution thereafter. It is the direct influence of these groups and the persistence of their ideologies which leads us to the era of Jim Crow and similar white supremacist and Nazi sympathist legislation in the US, all of which is to say, making Superman an overtly Jewish character was not a safe bet at the time of his creation. But why not today, or in 2013, I guess? Why not utilize the conversation where Clark is explaining how he's discovered his Kryptonian heritage to have Martha draw some narrative parallels to the character's own heritage? It's a perfect opportunity flushed down the toilet. John and Martha Kent own and operate a small independent farm in Smallville, Kansas, a state less known for its larger Jewish population than it is for its conservative history. The Kents are a distinctly working-class family trying to raise their son in a world where he may never be accepted on the basis of who he is and where he comes from. We see this all over the Smallville flashbacks too, like when John Kent is so worried he tells Clark that maybe he ought to have let a bus full of kids die rather than save them and expose himself.
Oh, Clark, you have to keep this side of yourself a secret.
The parallels seem too obvious to ignore, specifically given how the Jewish immigrant experience is fundamentally tied to the creation of the character in the first place. How much more powerful would it have been to have Clark showing back up to the Kent farm after finally having learned about his Kryptonian heritage as Kal-El from his father, and then following up that experience with a conversation about his Jewish heritage in parallel with his mother as Clark? And it would only be at this moment that Clark and Kal could come together to truly become Superman, or whatever, making him ready for the incoming threat of Zod, who still has not shown up, by the way. I don't know, maybe that doesn't seem subtle enough, but this is also a movie in which Superman is in his Jesus pose for 80% of the screen time, and who has a conversation with a random priest in a random church about how he should sacrifice himself for the rest of humanity, and it's framed by subtle stained glass Jesus floating next to his head, so we can all acknowledge that subtle's not the movie's strong suit either way. Regardless, I just think it's important and especially prescient given today's political climate and with newly emboldened anti-Semites and Nazis cropping up in the public sphere that we start recognizing Superman's Jewish lineage. This movie, and this scene in particular, were an opportunity to do that, which is what makes it so disappointing to me. Wasted potential. I'm gonna end this section by saying that I'm not Jewish myself, and that people with more insight than I have are watching or listening, please feel free to reach out. I'd love to hear what you have to say, and I want to emphasize that I'm most definitely not an authority on this matter. I just think that Superman deserves to be Jewish, and the fact that he isn't kind of sullies one of the better scenes in the movie for me. Speaking of things that further sully the movie, the world engine scenes get into something I've been meaning to discuss, which is just how much pointless exposition and sloppy writing really tank this thing. Let's talk about the scene right after Zod releases the World Engine onto the Earth and our heroes discuss how they're going to beat it. To clarify, the World Engine is how General Zod is going to turn Earth into Krypton and take the planet for the Kryptonians. There is some preamble to the scene, mostly from when Lois shows back up at the Kent's farm and says,
I know how to stop them.
and we get this random, needlessly scientific explanation of what terraforming is, just for the not Martian Manhunter to butt in and say they're turning Earth into Krypton, because Zack Snyder doesn't trust his audience, but I digress. When we finally get to the big making the plan scene, we've got Superman, Lois, Martian Manhunter, his scientist friend, and Detective Stabler all talking about the plan, the one Lois has, to put a stop to the World Engine. Lois says she knows how to stop it using Clark's baby ship. Superman walks up and has a great comedic moment where he suddenly knows how a phantom drive works, and he's like,
It bends space.
and the scientist says it'll cause a singularity, which is not something anybody mentions before or after this line, and the Martian Manhunter translates the word singularity into like a black hole for us because we're dumb. This is unequivocally the worst scene in the movie for me, and it's the perfect distillation of so many of the flaws in Man of Steel's scripting. There's no thematic or character significance to using Superman's childhood ship to blow up the World Engine, for instance, nor is there any to the idea that blowing up the World Engine will somehow suck Zod and company back into the Phantom Zone. How important could the Phantom Zone possibly be that the audience needs to understand that blowing up the World Engine with Superman's baby ship is going to cause the Phantom Drives to reopen the Phantom Zone, which is a place we barely hear about and never see, and that we forget was even a plot point by the time the thing gets blown up anyway? All we get of the Phantom Zone in this movie is a shot of Zod's ship being sucked into it toward the beginning, and I guess what's supposed to be the Kryptonian ship getting imploded back into it toward the end. I don't know, and neither does the movie, which is kind of the point. This needless, sloppy writing jumps out all over the place in scenes during the back half of the movie. Superman's going to get weaker as a result of being in close proximity to the world engine. Sounds good until he decides he isn't. The Kryptonian Codex, the future of the entire Kryptonian people, sought by Zod, given to Kal in order to decide the fate of his people's future. It's embedded in Kal's DNA by Jor-El. And Jor-El never explains this to Kal? Good plan for the one and only hope for Krypton. The cool S on Superman's suit stands for the House of L's commitment to hope in this movie, by the way. Are you starting to notice a pattern here? The World Engine Master Plan scene is like a full minute distilled into and wasted on this kind of shit. And it does nothing to expand the characters, tell us about their motivations, move or shift the stakes in any significant way, or add to the experience in such a way that warrants the inclusion of them in the first place. It's filler in an already overstuffed movie. The script during this moment is trying to play off itself and what it thinks the audience wants to know.
Defend space.
And as such, wastes a lot of time on bullshit that amounts to nothing, and it eats up a lot of that limited Superman dialogue and characterization once he puts on the suit. The net result of all these little wasted trips to the land of exposition is that these things wind up eating away at every opportunity to get to know the characters. We never get a chance to learn about anybody we're supposed to care about in this movie because they're all too busy talking to the audience instead of each other. And the fact that 95% of the things they explain to each other wind up being completely irrelevant only adds insult to injury. I can't connect to them because they don't give me anything to connect to, and it severs the thematic ties they're supposed to bind character, plot, and theme. Speaking of, I mentioned briefly that the S on Superman's chest stands for hope this time around.
In my world, it means hope.
Most thematic conversations surrounding Man of Steel talk about the contest between hope and sacrifice as thematic through points, connecting the story, characters, and audience. And the themes are what a lot of people who like this movie like about it. I do not share this opinion. Let's travel back to that idea about Zod and Jor-El occupying opposing hemispheres across an ideological horizon. And this time let's consider how their central conflict informs some of the movie's thematic ideas. Hope, for instance, seems like it should be an easy layup in the thematic department, and it's treated like a central theme here. Zod wants the future of the Kryptonian race to follow the trajectory it's been on for thousands of years, artificially birthing Kryptonians of specific bloodlines to fulfill specific roles for the betterment and continued prosperity of the Kryptonian people. The bloodlines thing is still dumb, but it's what we've been given to work with here. Jor-El alternatively wants to secure the future of the Kryptonian people by giving the keys to that future to the last naturally born Kryptonian, his son. Both men have hope for their vision for the future of Krypton. Unfortunately, none of this means anything to Clark. Clark meets Jor-El on an abandoned Kryptonian ship about halfway through the movie. The point of this scene is ostensibly to catch Clark and the audience up with the Kryptonian lore, and for Jor-El to communicate his hope for and to Clark. Up until this point of the movie, Clark has not been able to embody that ideal. Hope cannot exist if it's invisible to others, and that's the one thing Clark has to be, and has been, and so it is that Jor-El comes to inhabit the hope that Clark must too embody. Unfortunately, by the time we get to any place in the plot that hope for the future of the Kryptonian race has any meaning for Clark, it's already too late. Jor-El also tells Clark that he'll need to represent hope for the future of humanity and of the Earth, that he'll need to be the bridge between two peoples. But since so much of this is shoved into random, disparate pockets of screen time, almost none of it lands. We get little lines and moments, like Ma Kent asking Clark if his people finally showing up isn't a good thing, but we already know that Clark knows Zod's legacy, so what is there for him to actually consider when it comes to the hope for the future of the Kryptonian people? Maybe Clark is supposed to utilize this moment so he can transform the last hope of Krypton into a new hope for Earth, but it's too bad nobody ever talks about it. Hope isn't the only theme in this movie, though. There's also sacrifice. And in order to talk about that, I need to talk about a character I barely mentioned at all yet, and that's Pa Kent. Pa Kent differs here from how he appears in most traditional Superman media. Usually he dies of a heart attack and is an otherwise supportive adoptive father teaching a young Clark right from wrong. He usually lives long enough to see Clark become Superman, too. In Man of Steel, that's not the case. Pa Kent in this movie, along with Zod, is used to illustrate the theme of sacrifice. He discourages a young Clark from exploring his powers because he doesn't want Clark to sacrifice having a normal life, admonishing him every time he threatens to expose himself, and taking the opportunity to expound on the fearful nature of a world in which he does expose himself. This is a clever dichotomy between different aspects of sacrifice as a theme. Which price is more sacrificial, the kids in the bus or Clark's chance at a normal life? We get scenes of Pa Kent telling Clark about his origins, how to stand up to other people, how to keep his powers hidden, and explaining to young Clark that the nature of the world is to fear what they don't understand, and thus the calculated sacrifice has to be made. This is all supposed to culminate in the scene where Pa Kent sacrifices himself rather than let Clark expose himself by saving his life. Now, this is a pretty controversial scene, and I'm not here to dwell on whether or not this is something comic book Superman would allow to happen, but suffice to say that I don't think he would. No, the real issue here is that the thematic idea of sacrifice never comes back for Clark in or after this moment in a real kind of way, and the scene itself is sending mixed messages about what this is supposed to mean for Clark. There's a massive tornado that's threatening the Smallville folk on a highway, and Pa Kent takes it upon himself to help get others to safety underneath an overpass, which you shouldn't actually do during a tornado, by the way. As things are getting dire, Pa Kent gets trapped in a car by debris while trying to free the dog, who lives, and when he finally gets out of the car, he's injured and can't make it back to safety. As he leans against the car for support, Pa Kent stands there and tells his son to yield to his own self-sacrifice, and Clark obliges, sacrificing his father. So what does this moment show us with regard to Clark, his father, and sacrifice? Well, the answer is unfortunately not much. Pa Kent has a rough time being somebody the audience is supposed to care about, and he never does anything other than try to scare Clark out of using his powers, and more egregiously, he's never contrasted to Jor-El or Zod in any overt or meaningful ways. Pa Kent is completely removed from the ideological horizon established between Jor-El and Zod, which isn't inherently a problem, but his specific take on sacrifice never comes back to affect Clark at all.
Oh, Clark, you have to keep this side of yourself a secret.
He's not the ambassador or catalyst for Clark's humanity. He doesn't add any wrinkles to Clark becoming the bridge between two worlds, and though his sacrifice may spur Clark into acting from the shadows, that's still indicative of the fact that Clark has basically learned nothing through the sacrifice of his father. He carries with him Jonathan Kent's legacy of fear until he doesn't, and that's about it.
My father believed that if the world found out who I really was, they'd reject me out of fear.
If you wanted to dig into it, maybe you could scrounge something together out of the scraps of Jor-El wanting Kal to be the future of Krypton while Pa Kent wants him to keep that specific part of himself hidden. And so Clark is being pulled between two worlds and ultimately has to decide for himself what's worth sacrificing instead of letting others dictate that for him. But that's more thought than the movie seems to put into exploring sacrifice as a theme like this anyway. So there you have it. So where does all of this leave us thematically? Well, it all seems kind of confused and hollow. Hope, sacrifice, and Clark's place between the two never amounts to anything more than vignettes of people talking about those things in the abstract. Be the hope for the future of Krypton. Be the bridge between two worlds. Sacrifice one heritage for another. Guide the human race away from downfall. Am I supposed to take something away about sacrifice when I watch Clark murder Zod? Maybe there's a lesson about hope and sacrifice to be gleaned in the destruction of Metropolis. Maybe we get to see Clark struggle with the decision to sacrifice his father and Zod's wishes by sacrificing any hope for Krypton's future through the destruction of the Codex and Kryptonian ships on his own terms? No, instead it's all disconnected. And worse than that, it's surface. I've been ranting about this movie for a while now. There are aspects I wanted to touch on but didn't get to, so here's a quick lightning round before we wrap up. Lois is in this movie. Her characterization suffers the same gruesome fate as all the rest due to the clunky writing. There are moments when she and some other characters speak in voiceover, and it's pretty weird because the perspective never strays from Clark for too long, so I don't really see the point. Zod has two cronies that get less characterization than Nappa and Raditz. Detective Stabler earns his keep by shilling for the military the entire time so they can pick up part of the tab for Snyder and Warner Brothers with this line, which is pretty funny.
That craft maxes out 17,000 pounds. We can drop it from a C-17. It's a viable plan.
There's even an entire controversy surrounding Clark killing Zod, but who cares because I'm not attached to them as characters or ideas anyway. Krypton has alien dinosaurs for people to ride, just like Avatar. There are things to like here, but they're so few and far between that their promise is just transmuted into frustration for me. Michael Shannon as Zod is easily the best thing this movie has to offer outside of visual spectacle, which is on par with but does not exceed Snyder's usual work, like Legends of Guardians, House of Ga'Hoole. This is not. He brings a gravity to the role that seems like an almost ridiculous amount of effort given the performances of some of the other actors in the movie. Another thing that I don't mind is that Superman is more contemplative here. He's contemplative in All-Star Superman 2, and that's the best Superman story ever told. I also think that the scene where Zod gives his message to Earth is appropriately creepy and probably the best individual scene in the movie. Beyond these fleeting moments, always an idea and rarely an execution, Man of Steel doesn't have much more going for it as a wholly enjoyable piece. It's overlong, poorly written, has muddled messages and themes, and asks the audience to accept far too much for the little it brings to the table. The action's fine, it's probably the closest thing we'll ever get to a ground level DBZ fight in a movie, but what good is all that action without stakes? Without the corresponding battle between ideological convictions? It's fine enough as a movie for you and your friends to get high and talk over while you're watching it, but I came out of this movie feeling unexpectedly empty. Man of Steel isn't the worst movie in the world. It's definitely not the worst movie in the DCEU, but it does do the one thing a movie is never supposed to do. It wastes your time. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked the video. This was pretty fun to make. I'll probably make more of these going forward. So if that's something you're interested in, fucking hit like and subscribe, bro.